Australia's coronavirus death toll has risen, but the spread of the disease here is comparatively limited, with authorities starting to loosen up some of the restrictions that have been imposed. But the nightmare continues in the US, with one of its biggest daily death tolls of people in hospitals. Around the world now, there are more than 2.5 million cases. So here are today's key developments. In Australia, there have been 2 more deaths, taking the national toll to 74. A 75-year-old man died in a Sydney hospital and an 80-year-old woman died in Gosford, north of Sydney. Staff at Virgin Australia are coming to terms with the airline going into voluntary administration. Chief Executive Paul Scurrah remains upbeat about a turnaround and sale of the airline, with 10 potential suitors said to be interested. The US looks set to have its worst day of deaths in hospitals. More than 2,600 people have died just in the last 24 hours. The overall US death toll is now more than 45,000. It's doubled in just over a week. Confirmed cases have now passed 800,000 in the US. Human trials for a COVID-19 vaccine will begin in the UK within days. The trials process has been accelerated in the hope a vaccine can be in mass production by September. The death toll in the UK is more than 17,000. And Australia's most famous beach, Bondi, is set to reopen on Tuesday. Swimmers and surfers will be able to go into the water between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. on weekdays. People will still be banned from sunbathing or gathering on the sand. Okay, so let's take a look at some of those elements in detail now. The New South Wales government is set to expand its COVID-19 testing regime. The state has recorded its lowest number of new cases since the outbreak began. Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the new testing program will adopt a more proactive approach, targeting hotspots and at-risk communities.
We know the results are positive, they're all heading in the right direction, and we want them to stay this way. So I want to thank everybody for the way that we're managing this. Although it's been very difficult for many of us, everybody has really stepped up, and I want to express my deepest gratitude. We are looking to expand the testing regime. We already have, on average, on a good day, between 4,000 and 4,500, even 5,000 people getting tested. We've nominated the hotspots where that testing should occur in a more proactive way. We're asking everybody in those hotspots to come forward. We're also asking people who work with vulnerable communities or work in jobs where they're in contact with a lot of people, even through social distancing, to come forward and get tested as well. And in the future, of course, we will see that relaxed even further, to the extent where others will be asked to come and get proactively tested. We have one of the highest testing rates in the world, and that's one of the reasons I believe New South Wales is in the position we are when it comes to fighting the COVID virus.
New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian speaking there this morning. So sad to hear about those 2 more deaths in New South Wales over the past 24 hours. But once again, really low numbers of new cases. So just 5 new confirmed cases of coronavirus in New South Wales over the past 24 hours. Virgin Australia's CEO Paul Scurrah has rejected the assertion that the airline asked the government for a specific bailout. The company has gone into voluntary administration after the government knocked back a request for $1.4 billion in assistance. Senior business correspondent Peter Owen joins us now from Sydney. Peter, g'day. First off, how legitimate do you believe is all this optimism around the future for Virgin? Ever since we had that announcement yesterday, 24 hours ago, that it was going into voluntary administration, it seems basically everyone that's come forward is very optimistic that Virgin will emerge from this in some form.
Yeah, good morning, Joe. Look, there's a lot of optimism about Virgin, and the administrator, Vaughan Strawbridge, is saying that there are about 10 interested parties. Won't say who they are because of confidentiality provisions, but there are 10 serious bidders. There was speculation, unconfirmed, that the trucking magnate Lindsay Fox was interested perhaps in putting some money on the table, but you'd have to say there's extraordinary optimism. And Paul Scurrah, who I spoke with on the AM program this morning, was very, very upbeat and optimistic despite a couple of horror weeks that he's had in trying to convince the federal government and ultimately failed for that $1.4 billion loan.
Yeah. And so how can it be the case that an airline that was so badly in debt, and maybe you can just talk about that debt for us, so badly in debt and then hit with this coronavirus situation can survive?
Well, simply because there are bidders around the world, and I think the reality is that when Virgin is sold, it will be sold probably at a bargain price. And there are airlines around the world, private equity bidders who were probably just waiting for that voluntary administration to hit with the view that they would be able to pick Virgin up for a good price. Given that Virgin is highly regarded as one of the world's top airlines in Australia, as a very strong market. It's not really moving that much at the moment because of the government restrictions, but when the restrictions are lifted, airlines will be up and running again and booming. But that $5 billion debt was, really, the deal breaker, and it was a problem well before coronavirus hit. Coronavirus was the straw that broke the camel's back. And a lot has to go to the responsibility of the Virgin board, for not perhaps dealing with this appropriately before this economic shock hit.
Yeah. And so the federal government is adamant it's not going to buy into this airline or bail it out. And does that seem warranted now that there is all this talk about so much private interest?
Well, the reality was, and the government was sending this message through back channels and more recently in front of the camera, that if they bailed out a single company like a Virgin Australia or provided a direct line of credit rather than assistance to a sector, there would effectively be a conga line of companies lining up and wanting the same treatment. So the government was very concerned that they weren't going to set the precedent. They were going to deal on a sector-wide basis because they know that Virgin is perhaps the first major casualty that we're going to see out of this coronavirus crisis, and Virgin wasn't going to get that type of treatment. And this morning, Paul Scurrah said that he was very disappointed, of course, but they'd met with the government in person and over the phone or Zoom conferencing around about 8 times, massaged the proposal for that $1.4 billion loan quite a bit, but in the end it was a failed bid, and so there was really only one choice, and that was to send the administrators in.
And so for those 10,000 odd Virgin employees around the nation now, some of whom might be watching, what's the message that this could be? The administrators are saying they should have an idea within a couple of months, and they're keeping on people for the moment.
Yeah, the administrator, Vaughan Strawbridge, is talking about 2 to 3 months to restructure the finances, get Virgin to the point where they can might see it as a viable sale.
Yeah. And Peter, just one other question. What's happening with ground staff? And this just isn't Virgin staff, this is ground staff calling on the government for help?
Yeah, that's right. Look, there's something like a $69 billion sector of third-party companies that provide ground services, security services, etc., check-in services for the big airlines, Qantas and Virgin. They're now calling for a $125 million package to assist them in getting through this crisis. And they're saying that unless they get this, they're going to have to start laying off staff and potentially liquidating equipment, which would make it very difficult in the case that it actually is sold and wants to get back up on the ground to start flying again. Airlines can't operate without this type of ground crew available there. So this is potentially another mini crisis here, and the government's going to be hit up for potentially $125 million from ground staff services. And one of the big companies, Swissport, is making this claim and saying that they'll have to take drastic action unless they get that type of assistance.
Okay, Peter Ryan there in Sydney. US President Donald Trump says immigration to the US will be suspended for at least 2 months. North America correspondent David Lipson joins us now from Washington. David, g'day. Just staggering figures out of the US once again. One of the websites is saying 2,600, more than 2,600 dead in hospitals in the US just in the past 24 hours. 45,000 dead there in the US now overall. The president at the moment is focusing on immigration.
Yeah, well, he's focusing on a lot of things. Good morning, Joe. But yeah, certainly immigration is one of the big things that he has focused on, and something that's caused quite a stir, largely because he announced it without any warning via Twitter late at night, no further details, and it really sent a lot of officials into a spin. Businesses too, here in the United States, who rely on immigration for a good portion of their labour. Well, it took almost 24 hours for the president to clarify exactly what he meant by that tweet. It seems that it will be, as you mentioned, for 60 days. It seems like the focus is very much on people who are applying for permanent residency, so green cards in the United States. And it doesn't look like it will apply to temporary work visas. But we still haven't seen any documentation. We still haven't seen the detail. That's actually still being worked out. And we're not expected to see the president sign this executive order before tomorrow. So still a lot of uncertainty around that and exactly what it'll mean. And interesting as well to note that the president is claiming that this is not just to protect American jobs, but also for health reasons. But remember, of course, as you mentioned, those death numbers are just so horrifically high. There's just not a lot of people, trying to get to the United States at this time. Along with that, there's a lot of travel bans, and so on the health front, it's hard to see how stopping immigration at this time, when the US has the highest death count and the highest hospitalisations, could be effective.
Yeah. And David, how have Australians in the US reacted?
Well, they were sent into a bit of a spin as well. We've spoken to a number of them today, including one man from who's living in Boston. He's a gym instructor. He is right now waiting to hear back on his application for a green card. So he's worried. He doesn't know where this leaves him. He's started making contingency plans in the worst case scenario that he might be deported from here at some point. Now, there's no suggestion that will happen, but we just don't know. We just don't have the detail. We spoke also to several baristas in New York. Of course, a lot of Australians making coffee in New York. They've really made an impact on the cafe culture in that city, but they've obviously been impacted very hard by the coronavirus. They don't look like they will be affected, but they had 24 hours where they were utterly stressed out, didn't know what it was going to mean for them, if they were going to have to pack up and leave, get on planes, have to quarantine, all of that sort of thing. And as I say, they're having a very tough time. This was one of the cafe owners that we spoke today.
Obviously, we're all kind of struggling at the moment. Australian cafes are in this kind of predicament where obviously they're either closed or running at very, very reduced capacity. And a byproduct of that is obviously a lot of staff are in really tough positions. They're either not employed at all, they're either working only a fraction of the hours or days that they would have originally. Their tips would be down, their pay would be down, and obviously a huge proportion of that staff across all the Australian cafes are Aussies.
And David, what's the federal government there providing for small businesses caught up in all of this?
Well, they've finally struck another bailout deal. That is the congressmen and women here in Washington. It's worth about $800 billion in Australian money, and it will provide some relief, largely for small businesses who have been, most of them, shut down by this coronavirus. So huge sums, and it comes off the back of just unimaginable sums already. Trillions and trillions of dollars worth of bailout money. Importantly, this deal that was struck today and voted on in the Senate, it also includes a significant amount of money for testing, and we've talked a lot about the low number of tests that have been available here in the United States. Interesting that Congress has decided to whack a whole lump of money in to help ramp up testing at a time when the federal government, the Trump administration at least, has every day been arguing that there's no problem with the tests. Once again today, Donald Trump pointed out that the United States has done more tests, he says, than any other country in the world. Well, it's not so much a measure of how many tests you've done compared to other countries. It's how many tests you need, and the governors continually say they just can't get their hands on these tests. So good news that there is some funding there from Congress.
Okay, David Lipson reporting there from Washington.